South Africa is known for the power of its labor unions and the collective bargaining tactic they employ to get increased wages and add-ons when it comes to salary negotiations. In the past few weeks and months, there have been a number of strike actions that have come because of a breakdown in the salary negotiations between unions and industries, as well as unions and private companies and unions and the South African government. The current talks have become contentious. At present, public and mining sector wage negotiations in the country could lead to more strikes that will further disrupt business operations and public services, with the potential to spur limited bouts of unrest. In early May, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, demanded a 10% wage increase for public sector workers for the 2022-2023 fiscal year in talks at the Public Service Coordinating Bargaining Council. In addition, the union also wants a housing stipend, a bursary fund for children, relief funds for natural disasters, and measures for early access to pension funds. A strike action from COSATU could lead to the total collapse of schools, hospitals, and many other public sectors in Africa's most industrialized economy. In the private sector, other negotiations are ongoing. In the mining sector, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, started a strike on May 11th at the ArcelorMittal South Africa plant, the continent's largest steel producer, after the firm rejected the union's demand for a 10% wage increase, a housing allowance, and an 80% medical aid contribution from the employer. This strike joins the Sibanye-Stillwater gold mine strike that entered its third month recently. What's the effect of these strikes on South Africa's economy? Are the demands reasonable? And where do we expect some give and take to come from? Today, it's all about South Africa as the public sector wage talks linger. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun. Joining me from Johannesburg, South Africa, is Casper Badenert. He's the director and senior associate of Oleg Roux and Associates. Casper, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me.
So South Africa is quite notable for how powerful and influential its trade unions and workers representative groups are. But a lot of people may not understand how that came to be. So right before we get into the nitty-gritty of this conversation, just briefly explain to us how the unions came to become so powerful in South Africa.
Well, our constitution allows, or our labor laws in South Africa are quite strong, and many of our laws are based in terms of our constitution. So the trade unions, they see their foundation from Section 23 of the Constitution, which gives the right to trade unions being created and for citizens of South Africa or people within South Africa to join such trade unions. Now, their rights in terms of starting to bargaining with their employers are all found within our Labor Relations Act. And that is essentially the foundation that's given to their ability to go and bargain and try and negotiate better wages. In addition to that, and a lot of the times it gives strength to their ability to bargain and to negotiate, is the right of persons in South Africa to take action and then to in fact strike. If it is a lawful strike and they've given notice of their intention to do so, and there are all sorts of administrative steps that need to be followed. So, as you said in your introduction, that is a major concern going forward, that South Africa could see a large strike come ahead with these latest negotiations on the 10% increase that's being demanded. That could result in many public sectors taking the decision to strike, which could see a stop to quite a few services that are required in South Africa.
All right, so let's get into the details with this particular one we want to focus on. So the Congress of South African Trade Unions, they're doubling down, or rather it is doubling down on the 10% wage increase for workers in the country. But this also comes as South Africa, like all others, is battling to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and economic disruptions. The Russia-Ukraine war is also affecting the price of fuel and basic foodstuffs, as we've seen across the continent. But then South Africa has a third leg of this issue, and which is the highest unemployment rate in the world as of right now. Is COSATU asking for too much, asking for just enough, or is it just an issue of timing that becomes a sticky point for this conversation?
Well, if one takes it from the perspective of the Constitutional Court case that was heard earlier in this year, and I'm sure we will discuss that a little bit later, the request for 10% increase is in a sense slightly wishful, given the fact that that entire issue, which was then found in favor of the state, was exactly with this type of very inflated request of a wage increase, which is way beyond our inflation rate. One can certainly understand the frustration and the wish in order to have a much larger increase, given the fact that, and if you look at their points that they raise as a result, or why they require a higher rate of increase, is because of the high inflation of 5.9%, give or take, at the moment. The increase in petrol fuel, or petrol in South Africa, or fuel in general, at the moment is at its highest, I believe. It's the highest record in our history. And then they also look at other factors, the increase in electricity. And then also they take on the fact that South Africa has also gained from its revenue services much more than what they expected for the last financial year. So given all of those factors, they sort of calculated that 10% would be doable. But if you look at what has been budgeted for these wages by government, what they've said in their reviews for the year, and what they're requesting, it's likely to not be successful.
So let's talk about that case you mentioned. So all of this, the new demands, are also coming against the backdrop of the Constitutional Court's ruling on the implementation of Clause 3.3 of Resolutions 1 of 2018. But we've also heard from the Joint Mandating Committee of the Public Sector Trade Unions convener, who also pointed out that the provisions of housing for public servants remain a sore point, because they said even after signing this resolution, many of them remain homeless. And this resolution has to do with the government's employee housing scheme. But he also said that public servants continue to be denied decent housing by banks in South Africa, but they're still not eligible for RDP housing scheme. So the wage conversation goes beyond salary. There's always this housing allowance that's part of the conversation, but it also begs the question, is South Africa doing enough for its civil servants, for its public servants, when it comes to negotiations around public sector workers and their wages?
Look, certainly I think there's always more to be done. In respect of the housing issue, that is a problem in South Africa in general. South Africa has a large issue across the board beyond public sector with the housing problem. I believe the difficulty that the public sector and the servants that they find themselves in there, and when they talk about that they are found homeless, which most likely is not relatively the case, but they are required to then rent and in the private sector for accommodation, but they might not get salaries which are high enough, or at least a majority of the servants might not get a salary that's high enough to afford a decent accommodation, but it might also be beyond the threshold of what is permitted to obtain an RDP house, which was essentially, for those who don't know, is a house that is provided by government. And that's probably the issue there. So it does go beyond the salary issue, but yeah.
All right, so before we go for a break, the fresh demand comes because already an increase in the demand, let me put it at that, is also because government has failed to honor the agreement it effected for 3% plus gratuities, which makes up the 1,000 Rand and then get you to the 2,500 Rand housing allowance. And this is a negotiation from 2020, and then of course conversations happened again in 2021. But when it comes to government's failure to follow through with agreements, how do you think that's affecting the present state, sort of the present atmosphere and sentiment around the current negotiations now?
Yeah, no, it feels exactly this 10% request is most likely a hit back at what occurred with that agreement. I mean, there are reasons behind why that agreement was reneged on by government, and a lot of the times justifiably so. But there is a frustration, and it happens often when government concludes agreements with anyone, and they try to back out on it simply because they have the position of being government. So it's not to say that the frustration that they feel of being prejudiced by concluding an agreement, because one of the points that they raised in that case was that the Labor Relations Act, I think Section 23, says that persons concluding a collective agreement, which is essentially an agreement regarding these types of employment conditions, wages, and so on. Those agreements, when concluded, are binding, which is in South African law is the standard principle, pacta sunt servanda, where you are bound by your contract. Now, that is a frustration because they conclude the agreement and then they step back and they leave it. But I think there are justifications as to why the court didn't allow it to be enforced, because there are two competing rights in terms of the Constitution, one being Section 23 and the others being Sections 213, 15, 16, dealing with public finances and how those are controlled. And which one, in the end of the day, do you allow to be carried through?
So I need to ask this because we are also in the midst of some negotiations between the Academic Staff Union in Nigeria and the government. And oftentimes, the unions will ask for what seems reasonable to them and their members, and government simply just wants to either avert a strike or stop an ongoing strike. And it seems that governments readily agree to what they sometimes are actually unable to give or unable to provide. When it comes to these negotiations, particularly when it's public sector workers and the government, do you think all parties are realistically going into them fully understanding that not all their needs and not all their ask will be given? Government wants to avert and will almost say yes just so they can move on, and they just push the can down the road, because the unions typically will come back and say, you have failed to implement on what was agreed, and now we are renewing our strike action. It happens all across the continent.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what, in a sense, that happened with this matter, because if you look at the process, there were, during that period when there were negotiations, they were, the committee or the people tasked to attend to the negotiations with the trade unions were given a budget, and they said, this is your budget, you cannot exceed it. And there was about it was just below 130 billion Rand that they could use to budget the wage increases. Now, when they were in the process of the negotiations, obviously they would come to them and say, well, this is the process that we can follow. The trade unions rejected the first offer. They then postponed it, the meetings on the wages to December, rather to January of 2018. And during that month, they came up with, the government did, with a plan for a 5-year period of wage increases that was in excess of the budget. Immediately after that, that plan was rejected. Immediately after that, a 3-year plan, which is now the plan and the agreement which is was in contention with the Constitutional Court, that was then presented to the trade unions, but it, again, was in excess of the budget. So it would seem that although they were given the mandate of saying, this is your budget, you're not allowed to go beyond it, they still agreed to an agreement which was something that they couldn't agree to. And that is exactly what the court found. And I mean, there's more to it in terms of when they are at a point where they have to go beyond or exceed their budget, there are certain regulations in terms of public finances and how you go about it in order to justify that cost. And that is exactly what was the case in that matter. There were regulations 78 and 79, which the government then did not comply with, which the Constitutional Court just felt could not be condoned, given the fact as well, in the circumstances in South Africa and just coming off, or well, still being in this pandemic and struggling with the costs of that, they couldn't justify, it wouldn't be in the interest of justice to impact South Africa as a whole for a budget which actually only caters for 2% of the population. Because that is one major issue, is that the wage bill in South Africa is almost, it is the largest expense in South Africa's national budget. It's about 35%. And that budget, I think it's over 650 billion rand in terms of the budget for wages in public sector. And that budget only caters, as I said, for 2% of the population. So given those circumstances and that kind of facts, I don't think a court could justify allowing an excess of, for this agreement, and sorry, I jump around a little bit, but
no problem.
January 2018 agreement, they were in excess of the 128 billion that they had budgeted. They were in excess of 30 billion rand. And they couldn't justify that, but yet they continued with it.
With the negotiations.
Correct.
So, Casper, I want us to pick up on that, but we need to take a quick break because today is D-Day. The government is meant to respond to the union's demands today. And so I want to see if you can have a crystal ball to see what the response would be from government. But then also, what would be the impact if COSATU was to call a nationwide strike of those members who are part of the public service? So the conversation will continue after this. Today, as I said, is D-Day. The unions are waiting to hear back from the South African government as to what it says in response to its demand for a 10% wage increase, a 2,500 Rand housing allowance, and some other add-ons. Stay with us. Still with me is Casper Badenhurst, Director and Senior Associate at Olick Rue and Associates in South Africa, as we look at the public sector wage talks lingering on. Now, it does appear that at some point that some of the trade unions were actually sold on the 7% increase that was, I guess, tabled. But further talks with other organizations, including the Public Servants Association, led to the resolve to demand 10%. A 7% increase would cost the state 46.4 billion Rand, and the state treasury has been adamant that it only has 20 billion Rand for wages in the 2022-2023 fiscal year. So, Casper, when you look at the fact that some of the unions under all of the COSATU, under the Congress, were willing to take a 7% increase, and they've just been able to stick around with those who are demanding 10, wouldn't it have been possible for some of these unions to go out, break away and do their own negotiations? Must they be lumped together when it comes to this particular conversation?
Necessarily, no. I think it's a more united front if they were to stick together, and hence the reason many times they do. But I don't believe that they're under any obligation to accept what is agreed to collectively. Obviously, I mean, being trade unions in public sectors, normally it's in their best interest to have a collective agreement, which is exactly what it's called, as I say, to go on as a united front.
So you mentioned earlier that a number of public services would be affected. So let's expand that a little bit. If COSATU was to call a strike now, what impact would it have on South Africans, South Africa, and the economy as it stands?
Yeah, it would be quite massive. I mean, it'll impact almost every sector that we have, and for it to stand still would be quite it would be a massive negative impact to South Africa. I mean, we're no stranger to it. It's happened before. But, I think given the Constitutional Court judgment that was granted, which effectively puts the government in a much stronger position than what they would have ever been in, because essentially what it says is that if you engage with trade unions as the government, you may not exceed your budget unless you follow regulations. And those regulations being that if you aren't able to cater for that increase in your fiscal policies, then you must get the written agreement from Treasury, or if you're going to take from other departments' budgets, also their written agreement. And if that's not obtained, then you cannot go beyond what is your excess expenditure. So that is, in essence, if they come with a 10% demand, which government simply cannot cater for because it's not in their budget, then that puts them at deadlock because the government cannot accept it. So what it results in is exactly what you're saying. Their remedy as trade unions, as members of trade unions, is to strike. And that puts the country at a stop. And they're very effective at it because those services are essential to the country's efficiency and everyday running. So it is quite a concerning thought that is possible in our near future.
Especially in 2022. So when we put the Constitutional Court ruling into context, and the fact that today is D-Day, so government already has a limit to what its response can be. So we know that the response cannot be acceding to the 10% wage increase. What then do you anticipate government will say when they respond today? Is there a middle ground to be found? This is my last question to you, as time is not on our side. Is there a middle ground in all of this? How do you expect government to react today, with the deadline being today?
Well, looking historically at how government has treated the wage bill, and they've been very conservative, and they've been trying to be conservative in how they deal with it, because there's been a massive drive to bring it down. As I said, the wage bill is government's largest expenditure, so they've really tried. My sense on the negotiations today, given that we are again talking about an increase which is in excess of inflation, which normally they have looked at inflationary increases, but that it's almost, it's like 3%, 4% over the inflation rate. I don't believe government will be in a position to accept it because their budget doesn't allow for it. In terms of a middle ground, it's hard to say. I think they're going to have to shift quite a few things around in order to make the offer slightly more attractive to members of the public sector. So
I have to just sneak this in. The public sector knows that governments cannot agree to the 10%. They're aware of the court ruling. They're aware of the restrictions around the negotiations that are being had now. So wouldn't we expect it to be the unions that have to do a bit more shifting, as it may be, away from that 10%?
Well, you would think so. I mean, they would need to come up with a plan and to say to the government, well, this is what we can offer in order to bring it in line with what you can provide to us. But I mean, historically, it has been quite a bit of a fight in terms of these things. That's why there are a lot of strikes in South Africa. So they normally start off with the most aggressive approach, which I suppose strategically most people go for, before there's a sit down and looking at what they are able to actually achieve.
All right, Casper, thank you so much. We'll be looking to see how government responds and then how, of course, the unions respond. So in the next 1 or 2 days, there'll be a number of updates to this story, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. So South Africa's government is meant to respond today to a 10% increased demand by the unions for South Africa's public sector workers. But with the context of the law and the Constitutional Court case, there are restrictions on what the government can agree to. What does that mean? Who holds the power now, and where will the negotiations move to after the conversation today and after the announcement by government? It's a story we'll be keeping our eyes on because it is the continent's most industrialized nation, and there are many issues tied to public sector wages and unemployment in South Africa. Up next is NC4 to watch. Stick around. And one of the very first stories we're keeping our eyes on starts in South Africa, where we just left off. The rand firmed in early trade on Thursday as the U.S. dollar eased as investors await a central bank rates decision where a hike is expected to contain high inflation. The rand traded at 16 rand 5 cents against the dollar, 0.31% firmer than its previous close. Public debt stock in Kenya, grew to 8.4 trillion Kenyan shillings as of the end of March from 8.2 trillion in December. New data from the National Treasury shows that the debt stock is split in the middle, with 4.2 trillion covering external and domestic debt, respectively. The World Bank will disperse a total of $30 billion to fund existing and new projects in Nigeria and other countries as part of a global response to combat the ongoing food security crisis. According to the bank, it is working with countries on a $12 billion project fund for the next 15 months. And finally, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Egypt will hold its third periodic meeting this year today to discuss the fate of the central interest rates, which are the main indicator of the direction of interest rates on the EGP in the short term. In March, the MPC decided in an extraordinary meeting to raise the basic interest rates with the central bank by 1% to reach 9.25% for deposits, 10.25% for lending, and 9.75% for the credit rate, discount rate, and price of the main operation of the CBE. And that's our show for today. We will be following very closely to see what the decision by the South African government is on the issue of the 10% wage increase. So stick around and stay with us right here on News Central throughout the day for the latest on that and all other stories coming from here on the continent. Follow us on social media, and don't forget to, of course, make it a date, 11 a.m. West African time, Business Central, business right here on News Central. That's what I meant to say. Anyway, my name is Tolulokwe Adila Ribalogun. Do have a fantastic day, and I'll see you bright and early.